Hi and welcome. This is the all network call from 5-2 for the month of October 2014. I'm Jonathan Reitz, welcoming you to the conversation today that will include Bill Woolsey, our founding director of 5-2. We'll include Clint Jenkin from the Barna Group and Tim Schuster from Brightpeak Financial. Lots of great stuff to talk about. We're going to focus on a follow-up conversation from an earlier all-network call that centers on a project that Barna and Brightpeak are doing together on the money challenges that church planters, that special kind of sacramental entrepreneur, faced in the early days of their church planting efforts. So definitely looking forward to engaging in the conversation throughout the next hour on some of the financial challenges that church planters face. Brand new, not yet released research from Barna and Brightpeak that we will dive into in just the next few minutes with Clint and with Tim. Of course, you are going to want to put your questions in there. You can tweet them using the hashtag 52Live or inside the Google Hangout application here. You can also open up the Q&A app, which will be in the menu on the left-hand side of your screen. If you click on that, it loads up. You can type your question in there, and we will pick up your question in the order that they come up with and answer some of those directly from the guys that are on the ground doing the research. That's what we're going to work on or work through in the course of today's all-network call. But like we do always, every single month, we're going to begin with a word from 5-2's founder. Here's Bill Woolsey. Hi, Bill.
Hey, Jonathan. Great to see you here today. By the way, I really enjoyed the trip that you provided Sunday afternoon there in Cleveland. That was pretty awesome.
Yes, and I got to say there is a large number of Browns fans that wish you would come back every single weekend. You played so well with you in our fair city.
I've been told before that I'm kind of like a lucky rabbit's foot. You just rub my head and everything turns out well.
Okay, now we're all poking out our mind's eye with that mental picture in front of us. So yeah, let's not start any new trends that we might want to not live into in the network.
Well, tell your lovely wife hello, and it was really a great afternoon, a great way to end a preaching weekend there in Cleveland.
Excellent. Well, thanks for being here, and definitely I will pass on my greetings to my bride.
Hey, well, Clint and Tim, thank you so much for being with us as well. And Clint, we're really excited to circle back with you in the work you're doing with Barna and Tim there with Brightpeak as well. Just a great group of guys that are doing some wonderful work for the expansion of God's church. So thank you for being with us today. I want to just kind of start out with our all network, really kind of revisiting some of the same information that I talked about last week with our catalyst, and that is our whole use of the word sacramental. I've received a whole lot of questions after Wiki about how we use that word sacramental, and we seem to use it a little broader, a little differently, you might say, than the mainline historical churches typically used it. And those of us from the mainline historical church, we know how it's commonly used. It's commonly referred to, it is the category that you might say that refers to baptism and Lord's Supper. A sacrament is a divine act instituted by Jesus. It conveys forgiveness because of the presence of His Word. It ties the recipient back to the cross, back to the empty tomb, all divinely by the power of the Word. But then it's wrapped in a material element. And so you've got water with baptism, you've got bread and wine with the Lord's Supper. Historically, generally speaking, when we say sacrament, we're really saying baptism and Lord's Supper. But you have noticed, if you've been with us any length of time, in 5.2, that we use that term broader. And it's very particular why we do that. We do that mainly because we want the sacramental presence of Jesus that is in you. We want that sacramental presence of Jesus that is affirmed on Sunday morning in the Lord's Supper, that began in your baptism, typically probably on a Sunday as well. We want that to extend throughout the week in your life. And rather than kind of see yourself as simply a Sunday morning or you attend church on Sunday, you're a Christian mainly on Sunday, and then you kind of turn that off for the rest of the week. We want that to be broader. So we really want you to keep in mind that the presence of Jesus in you is for the sake of the world, and as you go about your life, you're not some dualistic Christian, you're rather quite unified. And the same Jesus that was given in your baptism, the same Jesus that comes and camps out on your couch in the Lord's Supper, is the same Jesus then that lives in you for the sake of your family, your neighbor, your boss, wherever you go. So with that in mind, that sacramental presence, we also talk about how you and I, as part of the body of Christ, we're the little s sacraments of Jesus. Luther once called us the little Christs. We're the Galatians 2:20. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And so that same Jesus that is present by the power of his word in baptism, that was deposited in you in baptism, lives in you now. You can't get any more Jesus than you already got. He's all there. That same Jesus uses your flesh, your material wrapping, to live out his impact, his saving grace, his saving presence in the world. So that's why we want you to be using sacrament, sacramental. And when we talk about it, we're not replacing baptism in the Lord's Supper. We're using little s sacrament, but we are reinforcing the presence of Christ in us. So that's what I want to just share with the network here today, Jonathan, and make sure that as we're using the language, we're all kind of using the same language and the richness that is there historically in this sacramental phrase.
Now, out of curiosity, Bill, what questions do you anticipate people connected to the 5-2 network will have to answer about the use of this broader use of the term sacramental? What do you hear is coming up time and time again?
Oh, I suspect people will say, well, are you trying to replace baptism and the Lord's Supper? We would say, no, of course not. Those are on a shelf all to themselves. They might also say something like, I've never heard that used before that way. And frankly, historically, you don't have to go back very far to hear a sacramental presence discussion. So I think that's probably the newness of the phrase, how it's used, and we also tie it to sacramental entrepreneur. Mm-hmm. So we're melding this divine aspect with this how the world works entrepreneurial aspect, and again, really going for that unified approach rather than, I live in the world, but I'm not of the world, and therefore I put on my Jesus hat and take off my Jesus hat. No, when you go to work, you start a business or you start something new, whether it's a church or a small group, whatever it may be, you are the sacramental presence of Jesus. So I think that's probably where they'll hear it. We're melding some phrases that haven't been melded before. Mm-hmm. And anytime you do that, some people are going to get up in arms that you're using language inappropriately or whatever as they take a selfie of themselves, whatever. No, I'm sorry. That was cynical. I didn't mean to do that.
That's okay. That's okay. And I love the idea that this appears to be a brand new application of some of these ideas, but at the same time, this is really ancient and historical on top of it. I'm going to read a quote here that I heard a couple of weeks ago from Teresa of Avila. So, 15th century quote: "Christ has no body on earth but yours, no hands but yours, no feet but yours, and yours are the eyes through which Christ's compassion for the world is to look out." I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about here, is allowing Jesus to do his work through us as extensions of his kingdom, right? I mean, that's what I'm hearing from you loud and clear, right?
It really is. It's, some would say, well, you should just say incarnational, and we could just say incarnational, but there's such a richness in sacramental. There's a divine wrapped in a worship setting, and so when Paul says that live out the worship that God has given us, so Romans 12:1, that your life is an act of worship. So I just think there's a richness there that we can kind of retake and grow in some new ways, and it makes people think differently about what they're doing.
Okay. All right, that is a great set of insights for us, and I think that's a challenge that we can take seriously as the Spirit works through what 5.2 is up to. I appreciate it a lot, Bill. All right, you are in for a treat this afternoon. We're going to revisit this research project that Barna and Brightpeak have been up to about the particular money challenges that church planters face. Now, let me tell you who these fellows are. Dr. Clint Jenkin is joining us. He is a self-described insight scientist. I love that term. And the vice president of research at the Barna Group. He is joined by Tim Schuster from the Brightpeak team, who is also a bivocational church planter who is founding Midtown Church in Minneapolis, which is a missional community engaged in conversation about what it means to follow Jesus. So these guys have some significant bona fides, and they are ready to talk with us about what it means to make the most of financial resources for church planting. And of course, get your questions in either using the Q&A app or by using the Twitter hashtag 52Live. So Clint and Tim, the floor is yours. I'm going to hand it to you to start, Clint, and we will just sit at your feet and soak in the wisdom over the next 40 minutes or so.
All right, but no pressure, right?
Yeah, none at all.
Well, it's good to be back with you guys. For those of you who were not in on our first call back, I think it was in April, Brightpeak contacted Barna early or late in 2013 and said, we really want to understand what's going on with church planters and how Brightpeak Financial can be useful to them, but just want to understand that market. And so we began implementing a multi-phase research project. And the first phase was a series of webcam interviews with church planters. So we recruited a number of church planters. Maybe there were a couple of you who were involved in this, but we reached out through a bunch of networks that we had, and we recruited about 20 church planters from a variety of funding models. So some who were bivocational, some who were supported independently, some who were on salary with a denomination or organization, and really just started asking them about their financial realities. Personally, asking about their ministry's financial realities, asking about their congregation. I found some really good insights. We followed that series of webcam interviews with a large-scale survey, which is actually still in the field. And I think most of you would have received invitations to that. If you haven't taken it, there's still time, and nothing I'm going to tell you here is going to influence if you decide to go take that survey. And really trying to follow up on some of the things we learned about in the webcam interviews. Now, the webcam interviews are sort of a unique process because they're not done live. And I'm not going to get too much into methodology, but there's a couple points here that I think will help you understand the kind of information we got. The webcam interviews are sort of a video moderated interview where I logged in and set up an account with this particular software platform, and I pre-recorded 7 discussion questions, and they were all set in the server. And then as people participated, they would come in and they would watch one of my pre-recorded discussion questions, and they would they'd record a response. The key thing here to note is it's all very unstructured. I was recording questions exactly how I'm doing right now with a webcam, just kind of talking into the camera, and they would leave their responses the same way. But it wasn't live, so I was not officially interacting with them. There was a time gap in between. It gives them more flexibility to take the survey take the interview process at their own pace. Some of them would do all 7 right in a row. Others would space it out, and some took up to 2 weeks to finish it because as they have time, they go in and leave a response to the next question. The key thing there is because they're leaving a video response, we get more than we would get over the phone. We get to understand facial expression, body language, even a little bit more tone of voice than you get over the phone. So we get more nuance to the information that we're getting. But because it's not live, we don't have the same kind of there's a little bit more openness as somebody's talking, because they're really just talking to their computer. And sure, I'm there, but I recorded this weeks ago, and they're just talking. It's just them and their computer, and they're able to open up a little bit more. And I think that was key in the data that we collected, because we're asking some very personal questions about money. And that's a difficult conversation to have. And I think because of the way we did it, it was easier for them to talk about their financial situation because it's just them and their computer at their own convenience rather than talking to a person over the phone. It was also easier for us to interpret what they're saying because we have their facial expression and their body language. So I just want to let you know that's how we collected the qualitative portion of this. It's the best methodology I've ever used for really getting after very personal information because people, after a while, they get comfortable with the technology and they feel like they can really open up because they're not talking to an actual person, and they don't have to worry about how that person is responding to what they're saying. So then the survey that we did was an email-based survey. We send email invitations out. People click on the link and take it that way. It's very, very standard kind of way of doing a survey, but still asking some very personal questions. So with that kind of groundwork laid, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things we learned. And I'm going to start with some of the stuff we learned from the interviews and then go into the survey a little bit. So let me pull up my slides here. And first of all, I want to thank Brightpeak and in particular Chris Kopka for his role in making this research happen. As a researcher, there's lots of things I want to study, but I can only study them if somebody comes along and we work out an arrangement to study them. And so I was very excited about this one on a personal level. My dad was a church planter, and so I grew up in 4 different churches in Florida. So for me to be able to apply my professional skills to something that's of great personal interest has just been a real treat for me, and I appreciate Brightpeak's vision for what they want to do with this information. So this is going to be nothing new, but it was reinforced for us as we talked to church planners. You've got all the stress of an entrepreneur without the exit strategy. So entrepreneurs, they go into a business, and they're looking either for plenty of money or plenty of time, and eventually both. And that's kind of the traditional way of thinking about if you're going to start a business. Well, church planters go into this knowing that they're never going to have plenty of time, they're never going to have plenty of money, and they're doing it anyway. So it's the stress of an entrepreneur without the financial reward at the end. And it's all the stress of a regular ministry, but without the stability and kind of the support network that you'd have if you were going into an established ministry. And so you've kind of got that blend of entrepreneur and minister, but you don't have some of the benefits of those roles. You have mainly the negative side of those roles. It's really, this is why we call it a calling. There are 4 things we learned specifically in the interviews. The first one, money equals time. And you think, well, duh, you had to do research to find out that money equals time. What was interesting about it is a little different than just the traditional way we think about time as money. Money equals time is important to church planters because they actually don't have enough of either. So they can't make the same kind of trade-offs that we normally think about when we say, well, time is money. So if you have extra money, you can buy yourself some time. If you have extra time, you can save yourself some money. Church planters don't have extra of either of these. And so when they are faced with a scarcity of money and a scarcity of time, there's nothing that can really give. And what ends up happening comes from our second corollary. Time equals ministry. So let me give you an example that we heard in one of the interviews. One of the church planters said, do you have any idea how long it takes to find the best deal on paper? The ministry, this person's ministry, they don't have enough money, so they have to really scrimp and save on office supplies. Well, when you have to scrimp and save on office supplies, you're spending a lot of time online or in stores figuring out how to scrimp and save on office supplies. And when you're spending all that time, that's time that's taken away from preparing a sermon or visiting somebody. And for this particular church planter, they struggled with this because the people in their church actually knew how busy they were and would try to help by not calling them with problems or issues that they really. So it ends up taking away from what their true calling is, because the people don't call them. They say, well, I knew you were so busy, I didn't really want to bother you with this. And the church planter's thinking, well, that's the one thing that I want to be bothered with, and instead I'm spending my time figuring out the best price for paper when there are real needs that my people have for me. So time equals money, but time equals ministry. And so the natural connection here for those of you who like math is that money equals ministry. The more flexibility you have with your finances, the more flexibility you have with your time. Therefore, you're going to have more flexibility with your ministry. One of the stats that came out in the survey of the data we have so far, now we're still collecting data, but I don't think this is going to change that much because we have a pretty robust sample size already. um, these church planters who took the surveys said they spend about 20% of their time on things that are dealing with money, on financial issues, whether that's usually for the ministry, sometimes their own. And if you stop and think about one-fifth of your time being spent getting the bills paid or getting the best price on paper or whatever it is that are things you just want to get out of the way so that you can do ministry. So in a normal kind of professional setting, that's one entire day a week that is spent on financial or logistical concerns, which is not why any of you got into ministry. And so I found that it's kind of sobering. And I think Tim, you were going to jump in here a little bit. We're going to hear from Tim because I'm going to be kind of the play-by-play guy. Tim, with his experience, is going to be more of our color commentator.
Sure.
And so Tim, go ahead and talk to us a little bit about what you've seen with this time equals ministry and the scarcity of time and financial resources.
Well, yeah, thanks, Clint. I appreciate that. When I had first read this stat that 20% or 1 day of the work week essentially was being spent on issues or matters related to finance, it reminded me of a friend that I have here in Minneapolis, and they, with some friends, started a church in 2011, and like you might expect, he had bought speakers, he rented an auditorium, he recruited musicians, he made a promo video, and they launched their community, and this, my friend, he's the lead pastor, he spent most of his time on preparing sermons. That's really where his gifting is. And if you add that to all the other responsibilities, volunteer management, facilities, equipment, vision casting, one-on-one meetings, it didn't leave him a lot of time and energy for specifically fundraising. And whether he needed to or not, he was actually not spending that much time on finances. And after 2 years and about 3 months, this actually last June, he wrote a letter to the community, and I saw the email later, and it basically said, "Dear friends, for the last 3 years, my wife has worked full-time to support our family, and I've poured myself into the work of our church without pay because we care so deeply about this mission. And what's emerged for us over the course of the past few months is that me working full-time without pay is no longer feasible for us." As you're all aware, he goes on to say that having an incredible impact on people's lives. What started as a group of 5 people meeting in his living room grew to a community of over 40 people, but it still didn't have the numbers to support a full-time paycheck, or really any paycheck. He never took a single dime from the church, and as things kind of came to a head, they just realized this is no longer feasible. And the letter goes on to talk about the financial difficulties and how they've decided to close their doors, and they laid out their plans to say goodbye. And just like that, they were done. And I think, I don't know, it would be easy for me to say that he should have spent more time, but as an example of that, he just didn't have the time to be able to spend on fundraising. So when I read that stat, that 1/5 of a church planter's time is spent on fundraising or financial matters and financial management, my friend is the person actually that came to mind.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. It really is fascinating to see how these different things play out in real life. I think that we're going to talk a little bit later about the gap in education or experience that we see when we get into the survey. But I want to say one of the interesting things about that story is kind of how he was using his own. He was basically subsidizing his ministry, and you guys do this all the time.
Right.
And it was kind of in an informal way because he wasn't taking a paycheck. But that's basically his financial earning power is what he was giving to the ministry, and he's subsidizing the finances of the ministry. And again, you guys see this all the time. One of the other, the next corollary. So we talked about time equals money, money equals ministry. The next one is that ministry dollars and personal dollars are actually, I don't want to say they're intermixed, because I know that you guys, those of you who are doing a formal ministry, you spend a lot of time making sure that you've got all the compliance issues straightened out. As part of that 20% of time is making sure that you're not mixing the pot. But in practicality, because a church planter's is lifeblood and effort and energy is put into their ministry. When the ministry is doing financially well, that bleeds over into personal finances. When you have extra personal finances, it bleeds over into the ministry. When either one of those is struggling, the other one is struggling. And so we see money flowing from the church planter to the ministry in forms of just paying out of pocket for things that are ministry expenses. We see like giving up earning potential, that sort of thing. But then money flows back from the ministry to the person in terms of, in some cases, a salary or reimbursement. And so you have this very kind of dotted line about what is ministry money versus what is personal money. And that leads to all sorts of complications. How do you sort it all out? And we talked about this back in April, just the complexity of the situation. Now, what's interesting is when we did this in the survey, we asked people about, do they have difficulty keeping straight, or how easy it is for them to really differentiate between ministry money and personal money. We found in the survey that people were very kind of optimistic about this. Oh yeah, no, they're different. They're two different buckets, and no problem there. But when we really dug in to the stories that we got from the interviews, yes, on paper they are two different buckets, but there is so much transfer back and forth, formal and informal, that it really is not as simple as just saying, well, we've got this ministry money over here and personal money over here. And so that leads to the fourth corollary, and that is that money equals emotion. Again, we like to take the spiritual side and say God will provide. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and he gives us everything we need. And I've never seen his children begging bread. But in day-to-day life, when we're faced with a shortage of money, whether it's on the personal side or the ministry side, because again, there's so much intermixing there, that stress, that financial stress, becomes emotional stress. And one of the key things I think for Brightpeak to communicate, because one of their things, they want to be an advocate for church planters, not just a direct resource, but an advocate. I think that one of the big points here is that if you can alleviate some of the financial stress of a church planter, you are also alleviating some of the emotional stress. One of the ways we saw this play out in the interviews was somebody telling us a story about how people in their church brought them dinner or gave them free babysitting. And these were very practical, very kind of financial benefits, but it created a great emotional benefit as well. Unfortunately, the opposite is not necessarily true. It is actually difficult to alleviate an emotional stress without having some sort of practical financial surplus behind it. So one of the things that we saw was that as money becomes stressful, that just bleeds into the personal life. And again, you guys see this happen all the time. And I'm sure you have your own stories about this, but it is interesting to see. Well, I'll get to that in a second. It's just interesting to see for us as we're watching people talk about the financial struggles of the church, to kind of even watch their stress levels kind of creep up even as they're talking about it, and it goes back to that entrepreneurialism. Entrepreneurs have tons of financial stress when they're just starting out, but the reason they do that is because they're trying to gain something down the road. And for the church planter, the truth is that probably is never going to happen. You're never going to have that big payday that a secular entrepreneur expects to have. So one of the things we notice about pastors is that they are very concerned about their reputation. And I say, it sounds bad when I say it that way, but I don't mean it as a bad thing. As ministers, as spiritual counselors, you need to have a good reputation in the community or you don't have a ministry. And so it's a natural thing for pastors to say, to be concerned about how they're being viewed. And because of that, they tend not to talk about these sorts of things, about the stress of, well, we don't have enough to make ends meet and it's bothering me and it's actually bleeding into my marriage and my wife and I aren't getting along because she's supporting us and these sorts of things. And these are just kind of topics you're not going to talk about. It's why we did these web interviews the way we did them, is because we thought if we can get the right context and the right situation, we can get through some of that barrier. But what's interesting is when we saw the responses from the survey, we saw that the pastors are actually, just like we kind of thought they would in a survey setting, they're holding their level of stress, they're holding their struggles close to their vest. We didn't see the same openness in the survey that we saw in the interviews. In the interviews, it was very clear that a large percentage of church planters, excuse me, I don't like to use percentage with qualitative stuff, but a large group of church planters are really struggling financially and emotionally, and that did not come through in the survey. And so, you know, we've got, as a researcher, I've got two choices. I say, okay, either one of my findings is wrong. Either I'm wrong about the interviews, or I'm wrong about the show. I don't think that they're wrong. I think they're capturing church planters in two different ways of communicating. And so, but I do also think that there's a danger sign here, and this is a challenge for you guys. And I mean, I'm going to give you a challenge, and that is, you're not doing yourself a lot of favors if nobody knows about what you're struggling with. Now, I do understand, and I take it very seriously, that there are limits to how open you can be when you're in a leadership position, especially when you're in a spiritual leadership position. There are just natural limits to that, and there's always going to be a balance between too much information and being too private. But you need to find some way to achieve that balance, and whether that's we're going to talk a little bit later about kind of what to do with this information. But you've got to find some way to achieve that balance. There's got to be somebody that you're willing to be open with about what you're struggling with, what the real difficulties and dilemmas are. Because one of the things that concerned me when I looked at the survey data is I felt like I was looking through rose-colored glasses at what church planters were telling us. When I was looking at the interviews, I felt like I was looking at a very raw, very real self-reflection and explanation of what's actually happening, and it's borne out by all kinds of other information that we have from talking to church planters. But then when we try to get scientific about it and give the survey, I think we can't get past some of those walls of, well, no, everything's fine, God will provide, and I'm doing great. And I really encourage you to find some way to get beyond those kind of pat Sunday school answers. Maybe it's with your congregation or your people. Maybe it's with people outside of your normal circle where you feel like you can be open. But there's got to be some way to open up a little bit, show people what's really going on, and I think that's going to lead to a lot of stress reduction, but also allowing God to work through other people. So I'm going to throw it back to Tim for a couple minutes of kind of talking about some of, again, what he's seen and experienced, and then we're going to do a Q&A, and we'll go into the second half of this.
Cool. Thanks, Clint. Yeah, one of the things I love about my job is the little bit that I get to spend one-on-one with church planters. And a couple of weeks ago, I met with a church planter, and he's here in Minneapolis planting a church, and they're doing this sort of ground-up sort of parachute in and sort of bootstrap the whole thing, and he's got a very small group of people who are meeting, and they're still in their first year, and he's bivocational. So in addition to this church plant, he's actually working another ministry position, and so we met one-on-one in a closed room and learned a little bit about his situation, and I learned that he actually makes less than $2,000 a month, and the government is garnishing part of his wages due to a court order because he hadn't been paying his student loans. And we looked at, he brought all his student loan documents. A few of the letters hadn't been opened, and we started opening it up right there in the office, and I learned that he was actually in over $100,000 in student loan debt.
Wow.
And most of those payments were in default, and this is just about the worst that I've seen as a church planter, for a church planter, I should say. And we talked a little bit about his, these decisions and his ministry, and it was clear that the financial stress, that this thing that was happening was taking a toll on his ministry. He's sensing questioning his call and questioning whether this was right for him, and of course this raises all kinds of questions for us as a larger church body and for us at Brightpeak Financial, and wondering, is there a financial readiness sort of assessment that somebody could take, and if so, what would be the standard for that readiness? And we also know and firmly believe that imperfect people are capable of doing some extraordinary things in ministry, and that's the case throughout Scripture and even today. So, but we do know, and this is just one story, and I hope I don't ever hear another story like that. And the personal finance has an effect on what happens in the life and the emotional life and therefore spiritual life of a church planter.
I think that's a great set of insights, Tim. Is that the planter's personal financial life has to work on multiple levels, or the conversation around the congregation gets especially challenging. I think that's a good set of insight. Now, that being said, let me throw out a couple of questions that have come in from what the two of you have put out over the last 15 minutes or so. The first one is this might be a Clint question, but I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that. Of these corollaries that you've mentioned, the 4 corollaries that you put out there, which one appears to generate the most stress or take the most toll on a church planter in the early stages of a church plant? So Clint, I'll let you start, and then maybe Tim, if you have an opinion, we can add that after Clint's comments.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a good one. Let me kind of glance through them again here. I think in the earliest stages of church planting, I think it's the time and ministry, and finding or the time and money. Because finding out that your lack of financial resources are really bleeding your efforts away from your ministry for whatever reason, because you have to get a part-time job or because you have to hunt for deals or for whatever reason. So I think a lot of times church planters, they're so excited they kind of feel like, well, between my passion and the Holy Spirit, we're just gonna find a way and be creative and get it done. And then they find out, or they get in the middle of it and they realize that their financial scarcity is really cutting into the energy and time that they can devote to doing the things that they feel like they were called to do. And so you do kind of feel more like an office manager at a nonprofit than you feel like a clergy person. I think later, as the ministry expands and grows and is maybe on the cusp of being self-sufficient or is self-sufficient, then I think that whole personal versus ministry finances, because the complexity gets bigger as the ministry gets bigger. And so I think that's where those things can really kick in. It's like, okay, now I've got to worry about getting reimbursed, and I've got to worry about, okay, we've got enough money for donuts on Sunday morning, but not for coffee, so I'll just pay for the coffee, and I won't worry about getting reimbursed, and now I got to file my taxes. So you kind of get off of the back of the napkin chicken scratch financial management, and you really have to do some serious financial management. And then I think that one becomes more important as the ministry matures a little bit, but it hasn't matured enough where you can actually like bring in somebody to do this stuff for you.
Okay, those are good thoughts, Clint. Tim, what would you add to that?
I would add, a couple of weeks ago, I was hanging out at the Catalyst Conference. Some of you are familiar with this large conference in Atlanta, and found myself in a conversation with a young church planter there, and he's doing pretty well. He's 5 years in, and they've got some good things going. He's drawing a salary from the church. Things are humming and things are rolling, and in his words, he just feels absolutely blessed to be doing what he's doing. And we talked about some of the early stage struggles, or at least what the environment was like in the early stages for him financially, and I found myself just simply out of curiosity asking him what causes more stress in your life, or what has caused more stress in your life, managing your church's finances or managing your family's finances with your spouse. And he actually answered the family finances causes more stress for him. And of course I had made him choose between the two, but I think that shows that planters often they're managing two businesses, a family business and then this other family business called the church. And habits in one area sort of tend to inform habits in the other area, and vice versa. And so I think there's potential to feel sort of divided, to feel like you're living in two worlds, and then obviously those are different management techniques, but yet simple money in, money out can go a long way too. And I just thought that was interesting. It made me think of that. When both are humming really well, that's the best, and sometimes that's just not the case.
Yeah, I would agree with you that I know, thinking back on my own church planning, that was absolutely the case. That when my at the time I was single, when my financial life was happening the right way, I had a very different perspective on the church finances. So that's a great insight. Now, Bill Woolsey, I know that you wanted to put something into the conversation. What's running through your mind as you hear this?
You know, there are two things. First of all, just the theological background, right? Clint, you alluded to this.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of pride ourselves on 2 Corinthians 8:9. You know, the old phrase, God's work done God's way will never lack for God's supply. And I suspect that if you were run a spiritual gift analysis on most planters, they would rank high in the faith category. And so it's almost like the very thing that enables them to take the leap, take the risk, is also the very thing that throws them into the suffering vat of either not paying attention to the money or believing that somehow God will provide. And it's this weird catch-22. I would be curious to know how church planners compared to a general entrepreneurial, slice of the population, and are the close the door rates, similar in the secular world to church plants? That was just something I'd ask. But the other thing that struck me, and you alluded to this as well, where you said time is money, and we always flip it and say the opposite too. Money is time. If you give me a lot of money, I don't need a lot of time. If I don't have a lot of money, I got to take a lot of time. But when you throw in the bivocational reality that we're seeing across the United States, at least in the Western world, in church planting, and frankly in immigrant populations too, it's just kind of a general thing for them. I kind of scratch my head and wonder that we've had those high prominent examples of large starts, but usually when you peel back the onion or the curtain, whichever metaphor you want to mix, there was a boatload of money. There was a benefactor or something, or they tapped into a benefactor quickly. But generally speaking, those benefactors are not there. They have to be grown and nurtured, especially if you're a very young planter and you simply don't know a lot of people with a lot of deep pockets yet. And so I just wonder if the bivocational route that we're seeing the church go is, it is what it is on one hand, and yet, as you said, it's going to take time away from the ministry. And it also then, generally speaking, takes away momentum from growing the ministry to where it can become self-sustaining and have a life of its own. That seems to me to be a conundrum right now that we're facing.
Tim, Clint, what thoughts have you about Bill's comments?
Go ahead, Tim. You're the one actually doing this right now.
Yeah, I think the bivocational ministry and supplementing other sources of income can happen a lot of different ways, and I think as we peer into the future, we're going to see that entrepreneurial mindset taking planters and other ministry professionals in a place where they actually see their other thing besides the startup as a ministry in itself. That might be something from providing a good or a service as a way of building relationships with people who might end up in their church plant, for instance. So I think we're going to see a broader definition of ministry and serving the world, and you're going to see things like the nonprofit, for-profit, false dualism sort of collapse in some really cool ways. That'd be my guess as to what's going to happen, or maybe what I hope will happen.
Well, I could definitely appreciate wanting to move toward a preferred future along those lines for sure. So, now, fellas, I know you've got a couple things that surprised you that you learned in the course of this research project. Why don't you take us to some of those insights for the remaining time in our call this afternoon? So, Clint, the floor is yours.
Yeah. One of the things, and this piggybacks out of Tim's story with the guy he talked to who was in just a mountain of debt. One of the things we asked everybody who took our survey if they had personal debt. If they did have personal debt, we said, how big of a issue is it for you? Is it a huge issue? Is it a major issue? Is it a minor issue? Or is it not really an issue? And I'm paraphrasing, but those were basically the questions. But the top answer there really was a huge issue. This is a huge issue for me. Now, what percent? Well, and I'll ask you, Tim and guys, I'll ask you this, my panel here. What percent would you think that personal debt is a huge issue for? And I'm not trying to trick you because I probably will answer this in a very similar way that you would.
I would guess half.
Yeah.
More
Go
than
ahead,
half.
Bill. Yeah, I would have said 2/3.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know how many in our what percent in our survey marked that box that personal debt was a huge issue? 2%. 2%. Now, I don't like to doubt my own data, but I do not believe them.
Wow.
I don't believe that 1 out of 50 personal debt is a huge issue. I think it's got to be. I would have said 1/3 to 1/2 is what my guess would have been. I still think that's true. And in doing our interviews, we can't get percentages from our interviews because it was such a small group. But it's not 2%. It's a much bigger number than 2%, where personal finances is having a huge impact on their lives or on their ministry. But only 2% are going to put it down on a survey. So it's funny when you ask what surprises you, because after you know the answers, well, nothing surprises you. So I guess I shouldn't say I'm surprised that so few would admit it, but I am kind of surprised that so few would admit it. And so that was interesting to me. I think one of the other questions we asked. So Brightpeak is a part of Thrivent, and Thrivent has a question. They call it their 5S question, and I'm just going to kind of paraphrase it because I don't remember all the exact wordings on it. But it's a way of figuring out where somebody is financially, and so you can ask, are you subsisting? Are you just barely making it? And they have S words for all these. I'm going to forget. Are you stable? Do you have a little bit of a surplus? Do you have a big surplus? So it's kind of like you've got 2 levels of not having enough. You've got one level right in the middle. It's like, well, I've just got enough. And then you've got 2 levels having more than enough. And so it's 5 levels of financial security, really. Oh, that's actually one of them, secure. So we asked church planters where they are on this scale. Would you say that you really don't have enough, you almost have enough, you just have enough, you have more than enough, you have plenty? And the numbers came back where about half said, no, I'm at that stable part. I have enough. And it was only about a third who would say, no, I don't have enough finances. And again, I call it a gallant optimism, because I think they're basically saying, well, I have this much, and so really I might be at level 2, where I'm not quite stable yet, but I have enough faith to say I'm at level 3, or I have enough faith to say I'm at level 4, because. And so I think, again, we're seeing, and like I said, a gallant optimism. But I was surprised when I looked at that question, because I really thought we'd have more church planters who would say, you know what, I am struggling to get by. And we didn't have very many who would say that. But then you go out and you talk and you get them to really explain what's going on, and you find out that most of them are struggling to get by. And so it's kind of like, I think they're saying, well, my faith takes me from the level I'm really at financially to 1 or 2 levels higher because I trust God. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not criticizing faith, but it did surprise me because I think we're not using the same arithmetic to answer this question, or to the people who came up with the question have a certain thing in mind, and when church planters answer it, they kind of have a different thing in mind as they're answering the question. We asked the same question about their church, and where's your church on this 5S scale? And that was where we saw the answers that we expected to see. Is about 2/3 said my church either really doesn't have enough or just barely has enough, or and so that was I think a more honest estimate when they were talking about where their church is or their ministry is on that scale versus where they themselves are on the scale. But as we see from the corollaries, where your church is and where you are is almost always going to be about the same place. You're not going to say, well, I've got plenty, but my church hardly has anything, or my church has plenty, but I hardly have anything. We're really seeing you and the church at the same place. So when you tell us, well, I'm stable or I'm secure in my finances, but my church is struggling, I think we're getting the more honest assessment when we ask them about the ministry than when we ask them about themselves. So
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I'm going to remember that next time I ask church planters questions about stuff, because now I know the trick, right? Now I know to ask them about their ministry, and they'll tell me more about themselves that way. Of course, I just told you guys the trick, so I'll have to ask other people because now you know what I'm up to. That's a little inside baseball for how we do research. But so I mentioned some of these things because I think there's when we look at the overarching ideas here about what is it that church planters need. You know, it's easy to say, well, church planters need more money, and I think there's something to that. But I also think there's plenty of things besides money that would help alleviate some of what we've been talking about here. And so there's I think 3 different support roles that I want to leave you guys with, and then Tim can jump in and kind of talk about how he sees this play out in practical terms. But the first role is that of an educator. Only about a third of the church planters that have taken our survey say that they have some kind of formal financial or business training or formal financial or business experience. So whether that's a class on financial management, whether that's having done another vocation where you're dealing with the business, finances and that kind of thing, only about a third say they have some kind of formal business or financial either experience or education, either one. And so 2/3, obviously, whatever training and experience they have has been informal. But more than half say they haven't had any at all. No training, no experience in the world of finances. And I say more than half. I mean, again, these percentages will shift a little bit as we get more data in, but I don't think they'll change that drastically. They hardly ever do. And so to me, that was surprising, right? Because most of these guys have either a bachelor's or a master's in church stuff. And you would think that somewhere along the way they would have taken a class that was about church financial management. And those classes are not that common. They are out there, but they're not that common. It might be more like a chapter in a book about financial management than an actual course about it. And so I think there's really room for education. The good news about education in the world that we live in right now is it's not limited to a university setting. So if you want to get to learn more and get more of a formal education about something, you can do that. Of course, it's going to take time, which is going to take ministry. But I want to encourage you, as you think about how to alleviate some of this stress, who is it in your life that can perform the role of an educator and really take you and teach you about this stuff? Is it going back to school? I don't think for most of you it is going back to school. I think it's more about finding somebody who's good at it and saying, hey, can I learn from you? But it's just that being able to sit and learn under somebody, maybe to shadow somebody, maybe in a church setting, maybe in a business setting, maybe another church planter that you see is doing this really well. But who is it in your life that can take the role of an educator and really kind of fill in some of the gaps that you have? And again, in the survey, people kind of said, no, I don't have any gaps. My education was sufficient. But then we asked them, what was your education? And about half of them said, well, I didn't have any. So again, we're kind of, depending on how we ask the question, we're kind of seeing two different things. So I think one person on your support team, and I don't mean support team in the formal like startup team kind of lingo of church planning. I just mean you personally. Do you have somebody in your life who can play the role of an educator? Do you have somebody in your life who can play the role of an advisor? This might be the same person. The difference between an educator and an advisor is an educator's role is to just impart information. An advisor is somebody who gets a closer look at what's actually going on and can give you a customized assessment or a customized advice of where you are. And so it might be the same person or it might be somebody else, but this would be somebody that you can bring in and you feel comfortable enough saying, let me show you my checkbook. Let me show you the checkbook of my ministry. Let me show you like the nuts and bolts of what's going on. And you help me either keep this on the right path or get this on the right path. That's the role of the advisor. And so I'd say in your ecosystem, in your social networks, who do you have that can effectively play the role of an advisor? Because it's something that we're seeing a lot of church planters need, but often are not willing to admit that they need. But I think that there's a lot of people out there who would be willing to play this role. There are a lot of good, solid Christian accountants, CPAs, or financial advisors. I have two men like this in my own life. I don't even have a ministry, but I just have two guys I can go to. One I go to with any kind of investment questions, which someday I'll need because someday I'll invest. But no, I do a little bit now. But then I have another guy I can go to with any tax questions. And it's just two guys that I've met over the course of my life, and I trust their advice, and they're very good at what they do. And I just kind of, every couple of years I'll have a question, I'll ping them with it. I'm going to be talking to them because I'm about to move from Colorado to New Jersey, and the company I work for is in California, so I'm going to have to figure out another, when I do my taxes at the end of the year, it's going to be complicated. I got 3 different states now I got to worry about, so I'm going to talk to this guy, and he's going to play that role of advisor. And that's just for my personal life, let alone if you have an actual organization that has to worry about compliance issues and tax exemption and all these sorts of things. So who do you have that can be that educator? Who do you have that can be the advisor? And who do you have that can be your advocate? The advocate's a little trickier to go find somebody and say, hey, will you be my advocate? But this is somebody who can speak on your behalf. Whether it's you're asking for a small business loan or a nonprofit kind of loan, whatever programs might be available in your area, and you need somebody to advocate for you to a credit union or to a bank. Or to donors. Is there somebody who can advocate on your behalf to donors or to grant organizations? But who do you have in your life that can step up and speak for you and tell people that you're worth investing in? And this might be financial. This might be. I mean, we kind of cultivate advocates in our life in non-financial areas. Letters of reference, that sort of thing. But who do you have that can be that financial advocate? Who you can take with you to a meeting if you're meeting with somebody about a loan or a grant or a salary or donation, or who knows other people with deep pockets. So I think those are the 3 roles that I encourage you to kind of look around your social networks, and maybe that second layer of your social networks, people friends of friends, and say, who do you know or know of who could be that educator, who could be that advisor, and who could be that advocate? Because those are the 3 roles we see kind of missing with a lot of the church planners that we're hearing from, and I think it could make a big difference in their ministry. So Tim, I'm gonna throw it to you to kind of jump in. Any comments you have, and I know there was one last thing you wanted to get across as well.
Yeah, well, thank you, Clint. Those are 3 roles that at Brightpeak we're very interested in playing, and specifically that advocacy role, in a very specific form of advocacy, I would say. We, on Tuesday, my colleague Chris Kopka, some of you remember Chris from the All Network call back in April, Chris and I were given this very small grant to host a dinner to say thank you to a group of church planters. And we had this incredible evening. It was planters, the pastors and their spouses, and these planters who were in the room with us ranged in from 2 years into their projects to the pre-assessment sort of dreaming stage. And I was asked to say the prayer before the meal, and as I bowed my head, it occurred to me, and I can't believe that it took me this long to realize this, but every church began as a church plant. I mean, every church was once a church plant, and every successful, thriving ministry was started by a person with a dream and some guts. So, again, that's just so basic and yet so profound for me in that same time. I'm impressed, and I am thankful for those of you who have taken upon the call, the sacramental entrepreneurial call to start a new community, and I'm wondering if you've been thanked. So please know there's a group of us who are we're advocating for you. I get to live in this really awesome world in which I get to be advocated for and part advocate, and I wish the same for a lot of other people. And underneath this research, we're learning that the call to plant a church brings out the best in people. And I'm just blown away by the integrity and the sacrifice of a church planter. So if you just need to be thanked today, please hear that. Thank you for all that you're doing.
All right, that's some great insights, some great encouragement from both of you. Appreciate that a lot. All right, we're just about out of time to wrap up. We need to wrap up our All Network call for this month. But from Clint and Tim, I'd like to hear one last comment. If you are a church planter that is thinking, you know what, I need to improve either my financial situation or my church's financial situation, where do you start? What would be your next step recommendation? We'll start with Tim, and then we'll go to Clint or what do you do to start improving your financial situation? Tim.
Henry Nouwen wrote a little book. It's super thin. It takes about an hour and a half to read. The title of Henry's book is A Spirituality of Fundraising, and he talks about fundraising as an active ministry, and that when you ask somebody to part with their resources, you are in that moment ministering to their heart. I would say read that book.
Okay, great. That's a great insight. Now, Clint, what would you say to folks looking to make that improvement?
Well, I thought of two, but I'm gonna stick with one. You got to be honest about where you are.
Okay.
You have to, and it's not a lack of faith to be honest about it. And I think a lot of times if we're really struggling, we feel like that honesty is going to somehow be a doubt on God's provision. But I think, especially looking at the survey answers that came in versus the interviews that we saw, I think there's a lot of guys out there just not being honest about what's actually going on. And then in 2 years, they're going to shut their doors and write a letter similar to what Tim read, and they're going to be heartbroken. And I think some of that can be avoided if we can really have the guts to face what we have and not consider that a weakness, a spiritual weakness.
All right, that's some great insight right there as well. So, gentlemen, thank you for sharing some of this new insight, some of this new wisdom from the church planting world. You've been hearing from, over the course of the last hour, Dr. Clint Jenkin from the Barna Group and Tim Schuster from Brightpeak Financial. Please accept our thanks to you from the 5-2 Network. Appreciate you being a part of the All Network call. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You bet. You bet. All right, Bill Woolsey, why don't you wrap up this month's call either with maybe if you have a final thought, if you have one, and a word of prayer to kind of put the punctuation mark on our conversation this afternoon.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think my final thought is just a huge thanks to Brightpeak and Barna. Brightpeak for having the foresight to really want to dig deep into this very critical issue that every planter wrestles with in his family, her family, time after time. But then also Barna for applying your knowledge, really coming alongside the church in a beautiful way. So thank you, and thank both of you in particular for your work. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for the gift of your church, and we thank you for the men and women who lead your church. We thank you for the blessing that they are to your greater kingdom, for the sacrifice that they undertake, for the perseverance that they wade through day after day. Father, I pray Clint's words, a word of challenge to them, that they would be more transparent and more honest about the financial difficulties that they face, so that as they do plant your church, they would do so from a place of health rather than from a place of sickness or even a disability in that area. Father, I ask also then that you would open the hearts of your workers, remind them constantly of those of us who are interceding for them and praying for them, lifting them up, and then especially for the grace and the intercession of your Son on our behalf. In his name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Bill. Appreciate that. Well, thank you for joining us for the All Network call in October. Next month in November, Thursday, November 20th, 1 week before Thanksgiving, the community development track from Wiki 15 is up for grabs. You will get information about what that call will cover coming up, delivered either on the 52.com website or directly to your email inbox if you're on our mailing list. Thanks for joining us. See you in November. Bye-bye.